Servius Sulpicius Galba, Praetor 54 BCE. A patrician who was attempting to revive his family's political prominence, Servius Sulpicius Galba was a lightning rod of controversy during the decade or so when he was able to force his name into the public discourse. In the winter of 57 to 56, Galba led 12th Legion into Switzerland for what he hoped would be more of a peacekeeping mission, but it ended up being a bit of a military epic. Taken off guard, Galba and his men found themselves desperately fending off wave after wave of attackers for 6 hours before they finally routed the enemy and then beat a hasty retreat back to friendly territory. While Caesar was not impressed by Galba's military contributions, he backed his run for a consular post in 49. Galba's defeat would mean that both of the Senate's presiding magistrates were obstreperous opponents of Caesar, and this made compromise highly unlikely. By early 44, Galba was among those who were plotting to take Caesar's life. I will argue that Galba's motives were primarily personal, as he felt that Caesar was making too little use of him, while making rather too much use of his wife. Despite not being a mover or shaker over the next year following the assassination, Galba made sure that he was not forgotten altogether by conspicuously displaying the dagger he had used on Caesar around his waist at all times. Condemned by the Lex Padilla, Galba's exact end remains unknown. Augustus and the other Julio-Claudian emperors treated his descendants well, and upon that dynasty's termination, Galba's great-grandson and namesake would briefly grasp the ring of power with his arthritic fingers. In the Roman Republic, anyone with patrician blood had a very good chance of becoming consul. And so we have to imagine that Servius Sulpicius Galba grew up with every expectation that he would, could, and very much should attain that office one day. His family, in fact, while it was not the most prominent patrician family, had attained the consulship within a decade of the Republic's formation. Then his branch of the family had emerged by the mid-3rd century, and then started to really kick off during the Second Punic War. To put it bluntly, this family was a beneficiary of the bloodletting of the Senate at Cannae in 216. So as many of the other prominent senators of the day were killed, members of the Galbi family were able to rise to prominence. However, that prominence had not lasted down to our Galba's time, as the last consul from the family was Servius Sulpicius Galba in 108, and we know that after him there was a praetor in 91, and probably the same man or his brother held a priestly office. Now, most likely the consul of 108 is our Galba's grandfather, and the praetor of 91 was his dad, but we don't know that for certain. It's just a likelihood based on the name. So I'd say it's about a 90% chance, but we don't know with 100% certainty. In fact, we know very little about any of these men on a personal level until we reach our Galba, and we learn about his personal grievances with Julius Caesar. When we first meet him, however, he is actually a supporter of Caesar, and he has already entered his public career. He would already be in his 30s, he's already held the office of quaestor, he's held the office of aedile, and now he is a legate in Caesar's Gallic War, commanding a legion. So this is where we first meet him, and everything we know about him will be between the time when he's in his early 30s and maybe his mid-40s. Caesar's typical practice with legates was to give each one a legion and then have preferences for which ones would get independent commands and have overall authority in his absence. It appears that by the end of 57, Galba was in very good standing with Caesar, as he was going to get an independent command. That makes me think that Galba had been there since at least the beginning of 57, and that he had also been present at the Battle of the Sabus, which was one of the hardest battles that Caesar ever fought against the Nervii. However, because Galba's name does not emerge until he's about to go on an independent mission, that is something that we can only speculate about. His mission was to go into what is today Switzerland in order to hopefully clear up the trade route there. There were mountain passes being harassed by local tribes, and those merchants had then written to Caesar asking for aid. From Caesar's perspective, what this would do is facilitate smoother trade between Cisalpine and Transalpine Gaul, and also hopefully show the locals the benefits of Roman civilization. So it was a bit of a hearts and minds mission. Not to mention that for the 12th Legion, which was beat to shit after fighting the Nervii, it would be nice to spend a winter not far from Lake Geneva. It would be a scenic area, and perhaps it would be a place where they could get some much needed rest. On the other hand, it was an area they hadn't really scouted much, and where the local tribes were all but strangers. The nearest tribe to them that they knew and was friendly were the Allobroges. However, as Galba marched west to east, he faced the three hostile tribes, the Nantuades, the Viragri, and the Siduni, and in turn he was able to defeat each one of them. He took a few of their fortified bases, and the tribes were brought to heel. As winter was about to set in, they agreed to formally surrender. They were handing over hostages, and they also agreed to provide him with some provisions so that he could spend the winter there. So far, the mission was a smashing success, and it looked like the 12th Legion was going to get a nice place for the winter. This also might have strategic implications going forward, as this would very much extend the confines of what was considered Gaul into the area not far from Lake Geneva. So far, this was off to a splendid start for Galba. Having gathered hostages, Galba seems to have believed that all was well and that he could trust the local tribes, at least for the time being. He decided to make his main winter quarters along the river Rhone. He selected a town called Octodorus, and what was great about this town is that it was split in the middle by the river Rhone. He and 8 of his cohorts would occupy one bank, and the local tribes would occupy the other. This would enable them to interact throughout the winter, and it would also enable them to be aware of the fact not only that he still had their hostages, but that those hostages were being taken care of as per the agreement. So this was another part of that hearts and minds strategy, and because Octodorus was one of the more substantial towns in the area, it would also enable him to speak with merchants to make sure that the passes were not being harassed by bandits. He also sent 2 of his cohorts off to stay with the Nantuades, who were to the west. They were probably about a day's march away, so if those 2 cohorts run into trouble, they would have been on their own. And actually, Galba would also be on his own because those 2 cohorts would not be able to respond very quickly if they were to learn that he was in danger. He had already started to fortify his quarters. That being said, while we know that he had a wall and a trench, Caesar doesn't give us an indication as to how far along it was. We get the impression that it was functional, but not yet completed. It probably lacked things like a batis and other kind of niceties, other flourishes. One of the main priorities, if not the main priority, was not completing the fortifications, but rather gathering in grain. It was getting late in the season, and we know that even after the battle, Galba would cite grain as one of his biggest concerns. In the meantime, though, before he could gather grain and before he could finish his fortification, 2 of the 3 tribes, the Viragri and the Siduni, decided that it was a great time to try to fight Galba again. And so they saw that he was not prepared, his men were divided, and some of them were off gathering materials. They also noticed that in the vicinity of Octodorus, there were plenty of places where you could muster a fairly large force undetected and then advance from higher ground onto the city. And so that's exactly what they did. They occupied the high ground all around the city and then advanced suddenly. And so the idea was to carry the Roman fort in the first rush and then overrun Octodorus from there. It's a pretty good plan, but as we'll see, the men of the 12th Legion would prove to be game. One imagines that as this attack materialized, Galba and his officers saw these men emerging from cover and advancing downhill at them rapidly. So what they would have done is rapidly grab their weapons, throw on their armor, and man the walls, such as they were at the time. They also quickly noticed that all of the high ground was occupied and that they were badly outnumbered. So while his men faced the initial assault, Galba and his officers held a quick conference. Some of these officers probably a majority, actually suggested that the correct course of action would be to leave behind all their baggage, break out west, and try to return to the province as quickly as possible. However, Galba decided that the best course of action was to try to repel the enemy and hold on to all of their equipment. So their baggage would include everything from their siege weapons to their personal effects. So it would have damaged morale and also made it difficult for them to replenish all the things they would lose if they were to break out west in this way. We have to remember that with winter setting in, had they returned to Gaul empty-handed, they might have been able to gather things from Caesar, but it would have been a massive pain in the ass to re-equip a whole legion with basic stuff. The Romans were able to repulse the first few waves with great skill, but then the enemy just kept coming. They were always able to build up momentum as they were coming from the high ground to launch their attacks. And problems started to set in as the battle dragged on. The Romans would run out of projectiles fairly early, so they ran out of pila, and they also ran out of arrows and stones for the slingers and archers who were probably there as well. Also, many of the men were wounded. And normally in a battle, when a man is wounded, whether it's in the field or defending a fort, that guy will get removed from the lines and go to be treated. But because of the attack on all sides, and also the fact that the fortifications weren't quite complete, the men who were wounded were forced to stay at their station and continue to fight. In fact, Caesar tells us that the battle raged on for 6 hours, and that the men had no time to rest or to swap out wounded men for fresh men. So this was a desperate fight, and it continued to drag on and on and on. And as it dragged on, it became more likely that disaster would set in and all of these men would be destroyed. The battle continued to drag on, and at this point it was getting increasingly desperate. Once again, Galba turned to his subordinates for advice. The head centurion, Publius Sextius Baculus, who had been badly wounded fighting the Nervii, and the military tribune Gaius Volusinus, whom Caesar clearly respected and called a man of great shrewdness and bravery, had the same idea. And what they thought was that the only possible path to victory was to do the unexpected and launch an all-out attack against the enemy. If they continued to fight this battle of attrition, which is what it had now become, they would eventually succumb. But by doing the unexpected, they had a chance of turning the tables suddenly. On the Gallic side, it appears that while they clearly had suffered a lot of losses up to this point, they were feeling confident. They knew that their strategy was working, they knew that they had caught the Romans unprepared, and that they would crack any minute now. But then all of a sudden, the Romans started charging out at them, something that they clearly weren't ready for, and whatever formation they might have had, if any, was not well prepared to receive an attack. And so the Romans, when they came out, were able to supposedly slaughter 10,000 out of 30,000 of the tribesmen. One suspects that these numbers might be elevated. Remember, a standard strength legion is about 5,000 men, and after the Sabbaths, the 12th legion was probably down to about 4,000 men, if we account for men who were still wounded from the action in the north. Not to mention the men who were wounded from that day's action. At any rate, Galba would then return to camp, rest briefly, which I assume would mean at least a day or two, because after 6 hours of fighting, one would be rather sore and worn out, and then gathered his other 2 cohorts while marching west, entered the territory of the friendly Allobroges, and there spent the winter. So this would be the last major action of 57 to 56, the winter that is, and I think it's safe to say that the 12th Legion had by far the hardest year of any Roman unit in 57. They went from the Sabbaths to nearly being wiped out in Switzerland. Let's consider Caesar's relationship with Galba and how this battle might have affected it. In his commentaries, Caesar never goes after his own officers. He never says rude things about their performance. He will credit them if they are brave, and if he doesn't have anything nice to say for the most part, he will simply note that they were defeated and move on. If he does take any jabs at people, he reserves it for Pompeian officers or Gallic commanders who betrayed him. If we look closely at his account of what happened at Octodurus, we see that he will name Galba, but he never really praises anything Galba does. He will, however, single out for praise Publius Sextius Baculus and Gaius Volusinus. And if we think about the value of having yourself named in the commentaries, it would be this. Of all the works of antiquity, this is one of the few that we know had very wide circulation. Not just among intellectuals, but this was something that was created for the whole public. The commentaries were sent back to Rome. All the senators read about it because the conquest of Gaul was a huge political issue, but it was written in a way to be accessible to common people. If you were someone who was not extremely educated, but you were still literate, you could probably read Caesar's writing. And even if you weren't literate, people would read this aloud. So if you were named in it, that meant that voters would get to hear about how Gaius Volusinus was shrewd and brave. Just getting named in the commentaries means that Galba's name recognition would have increased. But because he is not really portrayed in a positive or negative light, just in a neutral light, it wasn't that helpful. And so perhaps Galba, when reading this event later, thought that Caesar didn't praise him enough, and that had Caesar been a little bit more generous with his phrasing when describing the battle, that perhaps Galba would have been more successful politically, because people would remember that Galba was brave, or whatever other adjective Caesar might have thrown his way. Another thing to keep in mind, though, is that while Caesar was a politician and clearly could engage in disingenuousness, he also was a human who had feelings and opinions. And most scholars believe that in Caesar's mind, this operation was a total failure, and they also think that he was correct to think so. Now, Caesar technically tries to make this operation out as if it was mostly successful, but a lot of scholars now think actually it would be a generation or two before that area would be under Rome's control, and what this did was very much set them back. Strauss, who was writing about the Ides of March later, when he's introducing Galba to the reader, simply summarizes the campaign as Galba nearly lost a legion during the winter of 57 to 56. And that's a fairly typical summary of what happened at Octodurus. So because of that perception and because of the tone that people pick up on in Caesar's commentaries, Galba's generalship has generally been negatively judged. Although again, if we think about the campaign as a whole, as Theodore Arialt Dodge tells us, for the most part, Galba did okay. The early going of the campaign was fine. He won a few battles on a small scale. He then made peace with the locals, and he was trying to accommodate them. So I don't know if I'd go so far as to say it was all brave and sensible, since clearly he needed a lot of advice to get through the battle, but at the same time, Galba is not a rank incompetent, and he also was not so arrogant that he couldn't listen to others and benefit from their ideas. So overall, I'd say that Dodge makes a point that Galba is not all that bad, but at the same time, it's very clear that Caesar was not all that pleased. Otherwise, he would have noted that Galba was brave, or had done a good job, or kept his head, or whatever else. After Octodorus, Galba may very well have spent another year in Gaul, so he may have been there throughout 56, or perhaps he decided to head home. At any rate, we know that he had to be home by 55 because he put himself forward as a candidate for the praetorship. And not only did he win, but he won in first place, so he was assigned the urban praetorship. Then, after that prestigious office, he would have served as a pro-praetorian governor. We don't know where, and we also don't know whether he served for 1 year or for 2. At any rate, it's likely that he would have missed many of the key events in Rome, such as the death of Clodius because of his governorship. It's also worth mentioning that in terms of his relationship with Caesar, he would not have been present for many of Caesar's most important battles. I'm assuming he was there for the Sabis, but he also would have been missing for the 2 invasions of Britain, the crossing of the Rhine, and the revolt of Vercingetorix. So Galba may have been somewhat forgotten by Caesar because Caesar, since his departure, had fought more important battles. Then, in the summer of 50, Galba went up to be a candidate for the consulship of 49. At this time, he is still an ally of Caesar, and he is running explicitly with Caesar's endorsement, probably with some of Caesar's money, maybe with the votes of some of Caesar's soldiers. and running as someone who will represent Caesar's interest. So this was his campaign so far as we can tell. In his commentary, Caesar claims that Galba all but had it in the bag, that he was running well, that he was popular at the polls, and then somehow he wasn't elected. So Caesar effectively claims election fraud, but doesn't bother to explain how or why that happened. This may have been a motivating factor in causing Galba to ultimately turn on Caesar. Strauss believes that Galba thought that Caesar hadn't done enough to support him by turning out the vote. All we know is that there is a vague passage in Suetonius where it says that Galba blamed Caesar for his defeat. And I guess the more traditional way to take that is that the voters rejected Caesar and therefore Galba. But we really have no indication that that was the case or that there was a strong anti-Caesar sentiment at the time. Remember, Caesar's in the process of conquering Gaul, slaying the boogeyman, and people were benefiting from all of the plunder that was coming home. Not to mention that if we look down ballot, a lot of the candidates were doing perfectly well, who were pro-Caesar candidates. So it would not really make sense that the people would want to only send very staunch anti-Caesar consuls to office while also saddling them with a bunch of pro-Caesar praetors and aediles and tribunes. So that narrative that some people put forward in the past doesn't really work. We do know, however, the two men who were elected were Lucius Cornelius Lentulus Crus, who I've talked about before, and Gaius Claudius Marcellus, both of whom were staunch opponents of Caesar and started talking openly from the moment they were elected about how they were going to put Caesar on trial, end his proconsulship in Gaul, and hopefully end his career. And thus, the defeat of Galba will have immense implications, because after he fails to win a consulship, he has no way to check Lentulus Crus, who is the primary mover of the let's go start a war with Caesar wing of Roman politics. In terms of why Galba failed, some people have put forward the idea that he wasn't a good campaigner, but a lot of that is based on the presumption that because he didn't do that well in Gaul, that he must be incompetent across the board, which again, I don't think he was even that incompetent at Octodurus, much less do I think that would imply that he's a bad politician. Usually one's military skills and political skills are not the same. So, again, it may actually be the case, as Caesar says, that Galba got cheated. Or maybe he actually was a bad campaigner. We'll never know. But what we can say is that Galba certainly was bitter about the fact that he lost, and maybe thought that Caesar could have done a little more. When the Civil War started, Caesar did his best to sort of brand himself as a candidate for clemency and also debt forgiveness. One man who hoped to benefit from that was Galba. Galba had actually borrowed a substantial sum of money from Pompey in 52, and he had not yet repaid the full amount. That was made a little bit awkward when the Civil War started, as he was no longer paying that debt because Pompey was first in exile in Greece, and then he was defeated and killed. And so, after that point, Galba approached Caesar and asked for the remainder of the debt to be discharged. However, Caesar declined Galba's request, apparently the first time, and insisted that he repay the full amount to Pompey's estate. That would be in spite of the fact that Pompey was dead and his two sons were in the process of making war on him. Later on, in early 45, Galba must have asked a second time, if we make sense of the sources as they are, and this time, according to Valerius Maximus, Caesar agreed that Galba had a good point, and he paid off the debt from his personal funds. However, it appears that, and the chronology on this is not altogether clear, but it appears that this debt process for Galba took place over at least 3 years in terms of trying to get Caesar to do something, and perhaps because Caesar was so unresponsive to him and took so long to do the right thing, that this made Galba more resentful. Caesar was giving bigger favors to people he barely knew, and then a man who had nearly lost his life a couple of times for him in Gaul couldn't get anything from him, even when what Caesar was doing was to the benefit of a deceased enemy. So from Galba's perspective, this must have been, well, galling. When Pompey fled to the east, he took with him most of the senior magistrates in the Senate, and that meant that there was now a personnel crisis in Rome. Caesar had a rump Senate of his own, and he wanted to make sure that he was appointing magistrates to every office so he could claim to be the legitimate government. Both sides were trying the same game. The difference was Pompey, because he had the older senators, could get people who were qualified for the offices they were holding, whereas Caesar, because most of his supporters were on the younger side, had to promote men before they met the minimum qualifications under the Sullan constitution. This is not likely to be the kind of thing that would keep Caesar awake too late at night, since of course he had always been an opponent of the Sullan system, but still, it did hurt his legitimacy that he would have to give consulships to men who were technically 5 or 6 years too young to hold them. He did have one guy, however, who could have held that office: Servius Sulpicius Galba. We know he had to be qualified and of age because he had already run. And he also would be the right age, too. So he would be just about in the prime age, maybe a year removed from it. He'd be about 43 years old and 48. And yet, when Caesar was choosing consuls in 48, 47, 46, 45, Galba was never chosen. And Caesar, several of those years, chose multiple consuls and had suffect consuls. And none of them were Galba. Then he predesignated officials for 3 years prior to his departure for Parthia, and once again, Galba's name is conspicuously absent. So that leads to the question of why. Well, one simple answer would be that Galba wasn't interested in an appointed consulship. That could be something. That would make sense. But if that's not the answer, and instead Galba wanted to be asked but wasn't, then this would be a tremendous insult to him. Because a lot of the guys that were chosen over him were not only less qualified in a legal sense, but also less qualified in a social sense. Remember patrician pride. Galba is a patrician. He believes that while new men might be worthy of an office once in a while, it's really those old families who should be getting the honors. They're the ones who built Rome and made it what it is. And so for him to be passed over in favor of men who are no-names like Gaius Trebonius and Aulus Hirtius and Pansa is unthinkable. Not to mention that after he rewarded those men, Caesar started rewarding men like Brutus and Cassius, guys who might have the pedigree, but fought on the other side in the Civil War. And so, if we think about it from Galba's perspective, it's not hard to see why he would be furious at Caesar and wanting to murder him. Because remember, when aristocrats in the ancient world get offended, they start stabbing stuff. That's just their natural instinct. Another thing is, according to Suetonius, Caesar had an affair with Galba's wife. Now, whether that was recent or something that happened years ago, who's to know? But again, that could be an additional provocation. Now, normally extramarital affairs are not a huge deal in the Roman world. But they could be an additional provocation given all this other stuff. And if it was known to the public that Caesar had slept with Galba's wife, well, that would be more humiliation piled onto the fact that Caesar kept passing him over in this way, and also didn't write very kindly about him in the commentaries. So of all the people who might have a personal grudge against Caesar, I can't even be mad about Galba for wanting to murder him for strictly personal reasons. It kind of makes sense if we understand how ancient politics worked and ancient social norms. From Galba's perspective, Caesar deserved to die. If Galba explained his case to any other ancient, they would think that he's in his right to kill Caesar, pretty much. Given the public nature of Galba's dispute with Caesar over debt, there's a pretty good chance that when Brutus and Cassius started recruiting conspirators, that he might have been one of the first people they approached. Apparently, Galba took very little convincing. There's a chance, perhaps, that he helped them identify other Caesarians who might be sympathetic. That being said, so far as we know, he did not really play a significant role in the plot, aside from being another dagger. Certainly, he was not on the level of Decimus Junius Brutus Albinus, who was one of Caesar's best friends and gave a lot of insight into his movements and mind, and he was not Gaius Trebonius, an ex-consul, who also was someone who had been Caesar's second best general in Gaul. Galba was neither of those guys, but he does have one thing going for him. A number of the conspirators, if the later account of Nicolaus of Damascus is to be believed, in their haste to try to stab Caesar, ended up stabbing each other instead. But Galba apparently got his blow in and did not take or receive a wound from a fellow conspirator. So that might not be much, but it's something. Galba may not have been one of the leading conspirators, but he wanted to make sure that no one forgot that he was indeed one of the conspirators, and he had a visual means of representing his identity as a liberator. He decided to not clean his dagger, leave the blood on it, and wear it proudly on his hip at all times. Anytime you saw him in the Forum or in the Senate, he'd be wearing the dagger. If you had a question about it, he'd let you know that it was there because he had used it to kill Caesar. Later on, this will become a controversial thing. Mark Antony will be debating with Octavian over who is the true heir of Caesar. And during a Senate meeting, Antony drew attention to Galba's bloody dagger. And he said that wearing that dagger is a provocation and it's a sign of disrespect. But not only that, by associating with a man like Galba, Octavian is showing that he is not a true Caesarian and that he is not a true son of Caesar. Even though there are adoption papers that may say he's the new Gaius Julius Caesar, he's nothing like the old one. Otherwise, he would not associate with someone like Galba. So this was partly to try to keep Octavian out of league with Cicero and the Senate, but also to undermine Octavian's support among Caesarians. When we think about the events of the summer of 44 and on, we tend to think of Antony, Decimus Brutus, Cicero, and Octavian as the prime movers of breaking the fragile peace that had emerged in late March after the assassination. But we have to remember that Roman politics is never the story of a few people. There were hundreds of senators, and one of those senators was Galba, walking around like an asshole with a bloody dagger, bragging about taking part in an assassination. So Galba did play his part, even if it was a somewhat symbolic and small part. He was still there, and Antony was able to use him as a visual to represent the perfidy of Octavian and others. By the spring of 43, the peace had been broken for a few months. Antony and Decimus Brutus were at war in North Italy, and in the absence of Antony, his party had fallen out of favor. Cicero had taken command effectively of the Senate, and it had been decreed that the Senate would raise armies to go face Antony, who was now a public enemy. So the two consuls both set out and raised armies, and they were joined by Octavian and his volunteers. Octavian still had a great deal of sway with Caesar's old legions because of his name and formal adoption. And so this army marched north to face Antony and relieve Decimus Brutus. The resulting battle was called Forum Gallorum, and it was fought in April of 43. During this battle, Galba served as a legate under the consul Hirtius. Apparently, Hirtius' army was moving slowly, and he authorized Galba to go ahead with a substantial detachment to join Pansa, since Pansa encountered and started fighting Antony first. So Galba got in on the action early and would have seen all the phases of this battle. Forum Gallorum is not a well-understood battle in most ways. It appears to be almost two separate actions. Our descriptions are not that great in terms of how it played out. One of the reasons why our descriptions aren't that great is because Galba is indirectly one of our sources, and he mostly talks about what he did personally rather than what happened on the strategic scale. What the battle's most famous for, of course, is that the Senate won the battle, and yet both consuls fell. So Pansa was mortally wounded on the first day, and then the next day, Hirtius died in action. And then a day after that, Pansa finally passed away from his wound. In theory, someone like Galba, one of the legates, would now take command, but in practice what happened is that Octavian, using his influence, took command. So if anything, if we were going to insult Galba again, as most modern scholars do, it would be because he lost control of the army to a teenager, not because he did anything wrong. In fact, from his account, apparently he fought hard and well on a personal level, and he even tells Cicero in his description that he was nearly killed by friendly fire. It's interesting because a couple of modern scholars have said that this is evidence of his incompetence, without realizing just how dangerous battles are. And also, Galba seems to be a guy who fought pretty bravely in this battle, as well as in the earlier battles. We are talking about a guy who fought in 3 of the hardest fought battles of this period, Octodorus, the Sabus most likely, and then Forum Gallorum, and didn't get himself killed. So, maybe Galba was incompetent, but he certainly wasn't soft. Or maybe he was just really lucky, I don't know. First, he was forgotten by Caesar, and then Galba was forgotten by history. We don't know what became of the man after Forum Gallorum. All we can say for certain is that, like his fellow conspirators, he fell afoul of the Lex Paedia. After Octavian betrayed Cicero and formed the Second Triumvirate with Lepidus and Antony, one of the first bills that he and his new colleagues passed was the Lex Paedia. This bill overturned the previous Senate pardon for all of the assassins and established a court to try them. According to Appian, the court was very efficient. On a single day, they put all 60 conspirators on trial and condemned each one of them in absentia. As for the punishment, according to Cassius Dio, the liberators all had their property confiscated, and Roman citizens were forbidden on pain of death from offering them fire and water, meaning shelter. And so, Galba was a wanted man, but so were so many others. There's a good chance that he was among the nameless dead at Philippi. A number of conspirators died in action there or committed suicide shortly thereafter, but we don't really know. It's also possible that Galba led a life of quiet exile somewhere, and he simply lived low-key. But given his personality, I kind of doubt that. I suspect that he must have died in action somewhere, and Philippi seems like a good candidate, given how many other conspirators met their end there. It's also, of course, possible that he died in some other action, but I can't really imagine the guy dying quietly in his bed. A more plausible explanation than dying quietly in his bed would be he was traveling somewhere and died in a shipwreck or something like that. But dying quietly does not seem to have been in the nature of Servius Sulpicius Galba. Although Galba had stabbed Caesar and then bragged about it for a year, Octavian does not appear to have held a grudge against any of Galba's heirs. In fact, he and his successors in the Julio-Claudian dynasty treated the Sulpicii Galbae rather well. Galba's eldest son, Gaius Sulpicius Galba, you'll notice that now the senior name in the family will be Gaius, perhaps as a way to try to shift emphasis away from Servius, since that was the name of an assassin, served as a praetor, and also was a famous historian. Perhaps Octavian had held a little bit of a grudge because he wouldn't let Servius's son be consul, but still he became a praetor, lived a full life, had 2 sons, and also was a well-known historian of the era, although his work has been lost. Gaius had 2 sons, so that means that our Galba had 2 grandsons. One was also named Gaius. He was the Suffolk consul in 5 BCE. He then had 2 sons. The younger grandson, Servius, was notable, but apparently we don't really know any details about his service. We don't know what offices he might have held, and we also don't know if he had children, but it looks like he probably did not. That also became more common, by the way, nobles not having heirs. In terms of Gaius's children, the great-grandsons of our Galba were Gaius the eldest, who served as consul in 22 CE, and then the second son, Servius, who would be consul in 33, and, emperor in 69. But not for long, because he would get murdered by one of his subordinates, Otho, and Otho would get replaced by Vitellius, and then Vitellius would get replaced by Vespasian. Nonetheless, though, the man we just talked about is the great-grandfather of an emperor. And honestly, that's probably why there is any information on him at all, because researchers, when records were still available, understood that he was important because his great-grandson became emperor, so they made sure to dig up at least a few interesting things to say about him. So thank you to those long-lost researchers like Suetonius, who did the work of making sure that I could make this video today. Although it's inevitable that Servius Sulpicius Galba will be primarily remembered for being the great-grandfather of an emperor, he's actually significant in his own right. First of all, it is very strange how Caesar treated the man. Caesar needed someone with name recognition who was of age and who could hold a senior office for him reliably. Galba checked all three boxes so far as we know, and yet Caesar never turned to him. It's possible that Caesar knew something that we don't, of course, but it's also possible that historians who have said that Caesar was a terrible judge of character are correct, and that Caesar simply neglected this guy and turned him sour, that Galba betrayed Caesar because he felt that Caesar had already betrayed him. And if we're thinking of it from Galba's perspective, it's not hard to see why he would resent Caesar and might even be willing to put a dagger in the man. Caesar treated him like shit. Caesar not only gave him a passive-aggressive description in the commentaries, but then did not apparently support him sufficiently in the election, slept with his wife, and then didn't help him with a debt that he owed to Pompey. And so, it's not hard to see why Galba felt so disrespected. And we also have to take into account patrician arrogance. Galba had to see men with much lesser pedigrees getting rewarded, while he was languishing in obscurity as a non-consular. If we look into his near disaster at Octodorus, this is a great example of one of many times when the Roman military camp showed that it was perhaps the most important and most impressive Roman military institution. No military camp was ever carried by an enemy force, and what happened at Octodorus was one of the best stress tests ever, since two of Galba's cohorts were absent, and the fortifications were not quite completed. Because of this near disaster in Switzerland, and because of Caesar's treatment of him, a lot of scholars, even ones who doubt Caesar's judgment, have concluded that Galba was not very smart, that the man was incompetent. What I will say is, based on the evidence that I've seen, sure, Galba's not a genius, but he is head and shoulders above someone like a Metellus Scipio. To imply in any way that they would both be in the category of incompetent would really neglect that there are levels to incompetence. And if Galba is incompetent, then at worst, he's at the bare minimum of incompetence. To me, he seems like a bog standard Roman as a commander and as a senator. But Metellus Scipio is a whole different story. And of course, whatever Galba did wrong, despite waving around a bloody dagger and, well, using it in the first place to stab Caesar, he did not sufficiently alienate Augustus and his heirs to the point that they wanted his family gone. And so a number of Galba's descendants would serve as consul, one would become a famous historian, and of course his great-grandson famously became the Emperor Galba, who reigned for several months before he was in turn murdered. And so that concludes the story of Servius Sulpicius Galba, the Praetor of 54. Until next time, I'm Thersites the Historian. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and let me know if there are any other Romans you're interested in the comments below.